Chapter 2. Coffee, banned by God. By the middle of the 1400s, coffee had a real foothold in the world. It didn't spread through magic, dancing goats, or wandering saints. It spread through the deliberate endorsement of one specific man, a respected religious scholar named Sheik Gemaleddin, the mufti of the port city of Aden in what is now Yemen. Gemaleddin had traveled into Abyssinia. There he came to know coffee firsthand. He watched the locals drink it the way people anywhere drink something they've relied on for generations. When he returned home to Aden, his health had declined. He remembered what he'd seen, so he sent for some of the coffee he'd encountered abroad. He hoped it might restore him. It did. He also noticed something else about the drink. It banished sleep. Because of this, he did something that would ripple across the centuries that followed. He officially sanctioned coffee's use among the dervishes, the ascetic religious devotees of his community. This let them spend their nights in prayer with sharper minds and steadier attention. As far as serious historians can tell, this is the first reliable, dateable moment in coffee's history. It happened somewhere around 1454. Everything before it is legend. Everything after it is, at least loosely, historical record. Once one of the region's most respected religious authorities had put his name behind coffee, its spread accelerated fast. Lawyers used it to stay sharp during long nights of study. Travelers relied on it to push through nighttime journeys. Craftsmen who worked after dark, avoiding the punishing daytime heat, drank it to stay alert at their trade. People even abandoned another popular stimulant of the era, a plant called khat, still chewed today across parts of the region, in favor of this new, boiled, bitter alternative. Within a few decades, coffee had traveled from Aden to Mecca and Medina. By around 1510, it had reached Cairo, carried largely by the same dervish orders that had embraced it from the start. It was here, in these great cities of the Islamic world, that coffee stopped being simply a private devotional aid. It became something much bigger, much more public, and, to a certain kind of ruler, much more threatening. The first trial of coffee. In Mecca, coffee had escaped the mosque entirely. It had spilled out into dedicated shops, the very first coffee houses known as coffeehouses. People gathered there not to pray but to talk, play chess, gamble, and listen to music. They enjoyed themselves in ways that had nothing to do with religious devotion at all. To the deeply conservative religious establishment of the time, this was scandalous. Men and women mingled. Music played. Games ran for money. All of it happened around a drink nobody a generation earlier had even heard of. In 1511, the governor of Mecca walked past one of these coffee houses one evening after prayers. His name was Khair Bey, and most accounts describe him as strict and none too perceptive. He was horrified by what he saw. His first assumption was that the patrons were drinking wine, itself forbidden under Islamic law. He was reportedly stunned to learn the drink was something else entirely, something ordinary people all over his city apparently drank openly. Khair Bey became convinced that this mysterious beverage was corrupting public morals. He convened a formal council. Judges, lawyers, physicians, religious leaders, and prominent citizens, all summoned to rule on coffee's fate. What followed was, in effect, coffee's first public trial. The council brought in two physicians, brothers considered among the best in Mecca. One contemporary account dryly notes they understood logic rather better than they understood medicine. One of the brothers had already written an entire treatise against coffee. He arrived at the hearing thoroughly convinced the drink was going to put doctors like him out of business. The two testified that the coffee plant was, in the medical language of the time, cold and dry, and therefore unhealthy. Another physician pointed out that a far more ancient and respected medical authority had described the same plant as hot and dry, the opposite classification entirely. The brothers simply waved the objection away. They insisted it must have been a different plant altogether. It didn't especially matter to them whether the science held up. Their bottom line was simple. If coffee led people toward behavior forbidden by religion, it should be declared forbidden itself, logic notwithstanding. Only the mufti of Aden spoke up firmly in coffee's defense, the same office that had originally endorsed it generations earlier. He was thoroughly outnumbered. One overzealous witness even stood up and declared that coffee intoxicated people exactly like wine. But this claim only worked as evidence if the witness knew what wine tasted like. As a devout Muslim in a society where wine was forbidden, he wasn't supposed to know that at all. Pressed on the point, he admitted he had, in fact, drunk it, and promptly earned himself a public flogging for the confession. Coffee didn't fare much better. The council ruled against it. Khair Bey signed an edict banning its sale, in public or private, anywhere in Mecca. Officers shut down every coffeehouse in the city. Merchant stockpiles of coffee were dragged into the streets and burned. Burned in the street, restored by the Sultan. As with most prohibitions on something people already love, the ban didn't actually stop anyone. It just pushed coffee drinking behind closed doors. People kept meeting in secret. They kept brewing it at home, passing cups quietly among friends who understood the risk. One unlucky man was caught in the act. He was punished severely and paraded through Mecca streets sitting backward on a donkey as a public humiliation. But Khair Bey's triumph didn't last. Word of the ban reached the Sultan in Cairo, his actual superior, who was, to put it mildly, unimpressed. The Sultan pointed out that coffee was perfectly acceptable in his own capital. There, physicians whose judgment he trusted far more than Mecca's had found nothing objectionable about it. He reminded Khair Bey somewhat pointedly that even sacred things could be abused by some people. That didn't justify an outright ban on everyone. He ordered the edict revoked immediately. Khair Bey backed down. Coffee returned to Mecca's streets. History was not especially kind to the people who had led the persecution, almost like divine payback for the whole episode. Khair Bey himself was later exposed as corrupt, accused of extortion and theft. He was eventually tortured to death. His own brother took his own life rather than face the same fate. The two physicians whose flawed testimony had fueled the affair fled to Cairo after being discredited in Mecca. There they made an extraordinarily poor decision. They cursed the Ottoman emperor who had recently conquered Egypt. He had them executed. Coffee meanwhile went right on being sold in Mecca. Round 2. A riot in Cairo. Mecca's persecution wasn't the last. About a decade later, a physician in Cairo tried to stir up the same argument all over again. He worried, like his Meccan counterparts, that coffee's popularity was cutting into demand for actual medicine. He publicly questioned whether coffee should be considered lawful. His fellow physicians, to their credit, largely ignored him, and the matter fizzled out. The preachers picked up where the doctors left off. In 1534, a fiery sermon in one of Cairo's mosques whipped a congregation into a frenzy against coffee. The crowd poured out of the building, stormed straight into the nearest coffeehouse, smashed the pots and dishes, and roughed up everyone inside. The city split violently into two camps: those who considered coffee an affront to their faith, and those who considered it a harmless, even beneficial, part of daily life. It fell to the city's chief justice to settle the matter. He handled it in a way that deserves to be far more famous than it is. Rather than convening another hostile trial full of hand-picked witnesses, he summoned the physicians of Cairo. They once again stood firmly behind coffee's safety. Then, in front of the entire divided assembly, the judge had coffee served to everyone present. He drank a cup himself, publicly, without hesitation. It was a small, almost theatrical gesture. And it worked. The dispute dissolved. Coffee, rather than being banned, emerged from the controversy more respected than before. Constantinople. Luxury then a sudden death sentence. Coffee reached Constantinople in 1517, carried there after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. But it took nearly 40 more years for the city to develop its own coffeehouse culture. In 1554, two entrepreneurs opened the city's first two coffeehouses, one from Damascus and one from Aleppo. Constantinople fell for coffee almost instantly and completely. These weren't rough taverns. They were lavish social institutions, furnished with couches, patronized by judges, professors, palace officials, and merchants from across the known world. Everyone paid the equivalent of a single cent for admission and a cup. The Sultan's own household eventually employed dedicated officers whose entire job was preparing his coffee. But by 1570 the same old backlash arrived, dressed in slightly different religious clothing. Preachers complained that mosques stood empty while coffeehouses overflowed. This time, the reigning mufti sided against coffee, unlike his predecessor decades earlier. He found a strikingly literal legal argument to justify it. Coffee beans, he reasoned, were roasted and ground until they resembled charcoal. Islamic dietary law explicitly forbade eating charcoal. On this technicality, coffee was formally outlawed. People ignored the ban and drank in secret. A later, more permissive mufti eventually reversed the ruling. He argued reasonably that roasted coffee wasn't actually charcoal at all. The drink surged back into open popularity, and coffeehouses became a lucrative source of tax revenue for the empire's officials. The bag in the Bosphorus. Then came the reign of Sultan Murad IV. With him came the most brutal chapter in coffee's long history of persecution. Murad's powerful Grand Vizier, Khosrow, decided during a period of war that coffeehouses had become dangerous places. This time it wasn't for health or religious reasons, it was political. Coffeehouses, after all, were where people gathered, talked freely, and inevitably criticized those in power. Unlike earlier officials who wavered and eventually caved to public pressure, Khosrow enforced his ban on coffee with terrifying resolve. The punishment for a first offense was a beating. For a second offense, the punishment was almost unthinkable. The offender was sewn into a leather sack and thrown into the Bosphorus to drown. In one of history's stranger footnotes, wine, actually forbidden by the Quran, remained perfectly legal to drink throughout this entire period. Coffee, the sober, clear-headed drink that sharpened minds rather than dulling them, was considered the more dangerous substance. One contemporary observer suggested a darkly logical reason why. Coffee made people think clearly enough to organize, to plan, to conspire. Wine simply made them drunk and harmless. A ruler afraid of his own subjects might reasonably fear the sober drink far more than the intoxicating one. Even facing execution, people kept drinking coffee in Constantinople. Vendors set up copper vessels in marketplaces. They quietly invited anyone who wanted a cup to step into a nearby shop where it was still discreetly being served. Eventually, Khosrow satisfied himself that coffeehouses no longer posed a political threat. He lifted the ban entirely, and coffee resumed its place in Ottoman daily life, seemingly unkillable no matter how many times the state had tried to kill it. Persia's smarter approach. Not every ruler handled this problem with bags and beatings. In Persia, coffeehouses became just as central to public life as they did in Ottoman territory. But the authorities there figured out a cleverer way to defuse the political danger without ever banning the drink itself. The wife of Shah Abbas reportedly noticed that the leading coffee house in the city of Isfahan had become a hotbed of political talk, exactly the kind of gathering that made rulers elsewhere so nervous. Instead of sending in soldiers, she arranged for a respected religious scholar to sit in the coffeehouse every single day. He entertained the regulars with history, poetry, and legal commentary, carefully steering every conversation away from anything resembling criticism of the state. It worked. The coffeehouse remained one of Isfahan's most popular gathering spots. Its political edge was quietly filed down, and disturbances there were rare. Visitors to Persian coffeehouses in the following century described a lively, almost theatrical scene. Poets and storytellers perched on raised chairs, performing dramatic tales and satirical commentary to entertain crowds. They used exaggerated gestures that one European traveler compared to the antics of a stage magician. It was entertainment, ritual, and civic life rolled into one. It proved that a coffeehouse didn't have to be either suppressed by force or left to become a breeding ground for rebellion. With the right touch, it could simply be managed. A pattern worth noticing. Look at what actually happened across every one of these episodes, from Mecca to Cairo to Constantinople, spanning well over a century. Coffee was never banned because anyone seriously believed it was poisonous. It was banned because coffee houses brought people together. They encouraged conversation, sharpened minds, and created spaces where politics, religion, and grievances could be freely discussed outside the control of the mosque or the palace. That is precisely the theme that will define the next stage of coffee's story. If rulers in the Islamic world feared what happened when ordinary people gathered over a cup of coffee to talk freely, they had good reason to. The coffeehouse was about to become one of the most politically explosive institutions in human history, A place where revolutions were quite literally plotted over a drink that some of the most powerful men in the world had tried and repeatedly failed to outlaw. In the next chapter we're heading into the coffeehouses themselves. We'll visit the Ottoman and later the European, gathering places that earned coffee the nickname, the rebels' drink. These were the places that helped set entire nations on fire with ideas their rulers desperately wished had never been discussed.